Hello everyone, welcome to Dark Night. I'm here to help you drift into peaceful sleep tonight. I know many of you use these stories to find rest, so please like this video and subscribe to Dark Night for more whispered tales. Tonight the screen stays black, the rain falls gently, and 3 mysterious stories will guide you toward dreams. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let these shadows carry you away. The Midnight Delivery. This happened 3 years ago when I was working as a delivery driver for a small courier service. The pay wasn't great, but they let me work nights, which suited me fine since I've always been a bit of a night owl. Most of the time I'd deliver documents between offices or late packages to apartment buildings. Nothing too exciting, just driving around the quiet city streets while most people slept. But there was one delivery that changed everything for me. One that still makes me check my locks twice before bed and keeps me from taking certain routes through town. It was a Tuesday night in October, the kind of night where the air feels heavy and electric, like a storm might roll in at any moment. I'd already made 4 deliveries that evening and was looking forward to calling it quits when my dispatcher radioed in with one last job. "Got a priority delivery for you," Karen's voice crackled through the radio. "The address is 1847 Maple Grove Road. The package needs to be there by midnight." I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. 11:15 p.m. Maple Grove Road was way out on the edge of town, in one of those older neighborhoods where the houses sit far apart and the streetlights are few and far between. It would be cutting it close, but I could make it. "What's the package?" I asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity. "Just say personal documents. Clients already paid the rush fee. Just get it there on time." I picked up the package from the dispatch office. It was a manila envelope, about the size of a standard folder, but surprisingly heavy for what should have been just papers. The return address was smudged and I couldn't make out the sender's name. The recipient was listed as M. Holloway, 1847 Maple Grove Road. As I drove through the city center, the streets were mostly empty except for the occasional late-night diner patron or someone walking their dog. The radio played soft jazz and I found myself relaxing into the familiar rhythm of night driving. But as I headed toward the outskirts of town, that comfortable feeling began to fade. Maple Grove Road stretched out before me like a dark ribbon cutting through thick woods on both sides. The trees pressed close to the roadway, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel of visibility ahead, but beyond that, everything was swallowed by darkness. The house numbers were hard to spot in the gloom. Many of the mailboxes were old and faded, some partially hidden by overgrown bushes or leaning at odd angles. I drove slowly, squinting at each number as I passed. 823, 1831, 839. The houses themselves sat far back from the road, most of them dark except for the occasional porch light casting a weak yellow glow. When I finally found 1847, I almost missed it. The mailbox was black metal, newer than most of the others, but there was no house number visible on the structure itself. A long winding driveway disappeared into the trees and I couldn't see any lights from the road. I checked the time. 11:58 p.m. Perfect timing. The driveway was gravel and curved sharply to the left about 50 feet in. My tires crunched softly as I drove slowly forward, careful not to hit any of the low-hanging branches that scraped against my roof. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space between the trees, like whispers following my car. After what felt like a quarter mile, the driveway opened into a small clearing. The house that stood before me was not what I had expected. It was old, probably built in the 1920s or 30s, with a wraparound porch and tall windows that reflected my headlights like dark mirrors. But what struck me most was how well maintained it appeared. The paint looked fresh, the lawn was neatly trimmed, and there were even flower boxes under some of the windows. It should have been reassuring, but something about the perfect orderliness of it felt wrong, like a movie set designed to look normal. Pause 1 second. All the windows were dark except for one on the second floor, where a soft, warm light glowed behind sheer curtains. As I sat in my car for a moment, gathering the package and preparing to get out, I thought I saw a shadow move past that lit window. Someone was definitely home. I walked up the porch steps, my footsteps echoing loudly in the quiet night. The front door was painted dark green with a brass knocker shaped like a raven. There was no doorbell, so I used the knocker, rapping 3 times against the door. The sound seemed to be absorbed by the house rather than echoing back, as if the walls were much thicker than they appeared. I waited, listening for footsteps or any sign that someone was coming to the door. The only sound was the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant hum of insects. After a minute, I knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. The client had paid for midnight delivery, which suggested urgency, but no one seemed to be answering. I checked my phone. 12:03 a.m. I was actually a few minutes late now. That's when I noticed the door wasn't fully closed. There was a thin gap between the door and the frame, just barely visible in the shadows of the porch. I pushed gently, and the door swung open with a soft creak. "Hello?" I called out, not too loudly. "Delivery for M. Holloway?" The interior of the house was completely dark, except for that light I'd seen from outside, which was presumably coming from upstairs. The air that drifted out from the open doorway was oddly cold and carried a strange scent. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar, like old books mixed with something floral and slightly medicinal. I stood on the threshold, uncertain what to do. Every instinct told me not to enter the house, but I had a job to complete. The package was paid for, and technically, the door had been left open for me. Maybe this was how Monsieur Holloway preferred to receive deliveries. "Mr. Holloway," I called again, stepping just inside the doorway. "I have your midnight delivery." My voice seemed to disappear into the darkness of the house, absorbed like the knocking had been. But this time I thought I heard something in response. A faint sound from upstairs, like furniture being moved across a wooden floor. The foyer was spacious, with a staircase leading to the second floor directly ahead of me. To my left and right, doorways opened into what appeared to be a living room and dining room, though I could only make out vague shapes of furniture in the darkness. Everything was perfectly clean and organized, just like the exterior. I decided to leave the package on a small table I could see near the bottom of the stairs. There was already a neat stack of mail there, so it seemed like an appropriate spot. As I set the envelope down, I noticed that all the other mail was addressed to different names. Johnson, Martinez, Chen, Williams. None of them said Holloway. That's when I heard the footsteps above me. They were slow and deliberate, moving from the front of the house toward the back. The old wooden floors creaked rhythmically under the weight of whoever was walking up there. I looked up at the ceiling, trying to track the movement, and saw that the warm light I'd noticed from outside was now moving as well. Someone was carrying a lamp or candle as they walked. "Hello up there," I called, my voice a little shakier than I would have liked. "I left your package on the table by the stairs. Have a good night." The footsteps stopped. Paused 2 seconds. In the sudden silence, I became acutely aware of how isolated this house was. No neighbors for at least a quarter mile in any direction. No streetlights. No traffic. Just me, the darkness, and whoever was upstairs now standing perfectly still. I turned to leave, eager to get back to my car and return to the well-lit safety of the city. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps started again, but now they were coming down the stairs behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see who or what was descending those steps in the darkness. Instead, I pulled the door open and stepped quickly out onto the porch. But the footsteps followed me, crossing the foyer and approaching the open doorway. My heart was pounding as I hurried down the porch steps and across the small clearing to my car. I could hear the front door of the house swing wider behind me, its hinges creaking in the night air. But I didn't look back. I got into my car, started the engine, and began backing down the long driveway as quickly as I dared. It wasn't until I reached the road that I allowed myself to glance in my rearview mirror. The house was completely dark now. No lights in any of the windows. No sign that anyone lived there at all. But standing on the front porch, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall, thin figure watching my car disappear down Maple Grove Road. I drove straight back to the dispatch office, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I got there, I called Karen and told her the delivery was complete. I didn't mention the strange house or the figure on the porch. What would have been the point? But I did ask her about the client who had requested the delivery. Funny thing about that, Karen said, pulling up the order on her computer. The payment was made in cash, dropped off at our office yesterday with a note requesting midnight delivery. No phone number, no contact information other than the address. Just cash and instructions. What about the return address on the package? What return address? The envelope you delivered didn't have one. I thought about the smudged return address I'd seen when I picked up the package, but when I tried to remember the details, I found that I couldn't. It was like trying to recall a dream that fades the moment you wake up. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. During my lunch break, I drove out to Maple Grove Road in broad daylight. I wanted to see the house again, to convince myself that it had been a perfectly normal delivery to a perfectly normal residence. But when I found where 1847 should have been, there was only an empty lot overgrown with weeds and small trees. No mailbox, no driveway, no sign that a house had ever stood there at all. I asked around at some of the other houses on the street, but the neighbors I talked to all said the same thing. That lot had been empty for as long as anyone could remember. No one named Holloway had ever lived on Maple Grove Road. I quit the delivery job 2 weeks later, found work as a security guard at an office building downtown, where I deal with well-lit hallways and people who exist in the daylight. But sometimes when I'm driving home late at night and I see a darkened house set back from the road, I think about that midnight delivery. I think about the figure on the porch and wonder who I really delivered that package to. And sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder what was inside that envelope that was so important it had to be delivered at the stroke of midnight to a house that doesn't exist. The strangest part is what happened about 6 months later. I was working my security job, doing my rounds through the empty office building when I found an envelope on my desk in the security office. It was the same size and weight as the package I'd delivered that night. The same manila paper, and written on the front in handwriting I somehow recognized even though I'd never seen it before, was my name and the address of my apartment. I never opened it. It's sitting in a drawer at home, and sometimes I can swear I hear it rustling, like whatever's inside is trying to get out. But I learned my lesson about midnight deliveries. Some packages are meant to stay undelivered, and some doors should never be opened, especially when they're already standing ajar in the darkness, waiting for someone foolish enough to step inside. If you're listening now, where are you from? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. I'd love to know where my voice is traveling tonight, keeping you company in the darkness now. Let's slip into our next tale. The apartment above, I moved into the apartment on Elm Street during my second year of college. It was a converted Victorian house split into 4 units, and mine was on the second floor. The rent was cheap enough for a broke student like me, and the landlord, Mrs. Chen, seemed nice when she showed me around. What she didn't mention during the tour was the apartment directly above mine. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. She did mention it, but only to say that it had been vacant for several months and that I shouldn't worry about noise from upstairs neighbors. At the time, I thought this was great news. No loud music, no footsteps at all hours, no arguments through thin walls. Just peace and quiet while I studied. If only I had known then what I know now. The first month was exactly what I'd hoped for. The apartment was cozy with hardwood floors, tall windows, and enough space for my bed, desk, and a small kitchen table. The building had character, with original crown molding and vintage light fixtures that gave everything a warm, nostalgic feel. My neighbors in the other units were quiet and respectful. I felt like I'd found the perfect place to focus on my studies. The only odd thing I noticed right away was that the ceiling above my bedroom creaked sometimes, even though no one lived upstairs. Mrs. Chen explained that old houses settle and shift, especially with changes in weather and temperature. The sounds were just the building adjusting, she said. Nothing to worry about. But the creaking had a strange rhythm to it. It wasn't the random groaning and popping you'd expect from settling wood. It sounded more like footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps moving from one end of the apartment above to the other. I mentioned this to Mrs. Chen during my second month there, when she stopped by to check on a leaky faucet. She frowned when I brought it up, but not in a way that suggested she didn't believe me. It was more like she was remembering something she'd rather forget. The previous tenant upstairs, she said carefully, was an elderly man named Mr. Garrett. He lived there for almost 30 years before he passed away last spring. Very quiet, very routine. He had trouble sleeping, so he would walk around his apartment at night, the same path every night, from the bedroom to the kitchen, then to the living room, then back to the bedroom. She paused, testing the faucet she'd just repaired. Sometimes old habits leave impressions, she said finally, especially in old buildings like this one. The sounds should fade with time, but they didn't fade. If anything, they became more regular and more distinct. Every night around 11:30, I would hear them start. The soft creak of floorboards directly above my bed, moving toward what I assumed was the kitchen area. Then a pause, followed by more creaking as the footsteps continued to the front of the apartment. Another pause, then the return journey back to the bedroom. The pattern never varied. It was always the same route, the same timing, the same measured pace, like someone following a nightly ritual that had been performed thousands of times. At first, I tried to ignore it. I bought a white noise machine and played rain sounds to mask the creaking. I wore earplugs to bed. I even rearranged my bedroom so the head of my bed wasn't directly under the walking path, but nothing worked. The footsteps were always there, cutting through whatever barriers I tried to put up. After 2 months of sleepless nights, I decided to investigate. I knew Mrs. Chen kept a master key for all the units in case of emergencies, and I thought maybe if I could see the vacant apartment for myself, I could figure out what was causing the sounds. Maybe there was a loose floorboard or a structural issue that could be fixed. I caught Mrs. Chen one afternoon when she was collecting mail from the lobby. I was wondering if I could take a look at the apartment upstairs, I said. The sounds are getting worse, and I thought maybe I could spot what's causing them. Her expression immediately became guarded. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. The apartment hasn't been cleaned out yet. Mr. Garrett's belongings are still there, and it wouldn't be appropriate. I wouldn't touch anything, I assured her. I just want to see the layout, maybe figure out if there's a loose board or something. She shook her head firmly. I'm sorry, but I can't allow that. If the sounds are really bothering you, I can have a contractor come look at the ceiling from your side. But I could see in her eyes that she knew a contractor wouldn't find anything. She knew exactly what was causing the footsteps, and she didn't want me to know. That night, the walking was louder than ever. It started at exactly 11:30, just as it always did, but this time I could swear I heard more than just footsteps. There was a soft shuffling sound like slippers dragging slightly across the floor, and at each pause in the routine, I thought I could hear something else. A faint sound almost like whispering. I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, following the path of the sounds with my eyes, from directly above my pillow across to the far wall, then toward the front of the building, then back. The same route, night after night, with those strange pauses at what I assumed were significant locations in the apartment above. Unable to sleep, I got up and walked the same pattern in my own apartment, trying to understand what Mr. Garrett might have been doing during his nightly walks. In my bedroom, I started at the head of my bed. Walking to the kitchen, I found myself at the sink. From there, moving toward the front of the apartment brought me to the living room window that looked out onto Elm Street. That's when I realized what the pauses might represent. At each stop, Mr. Garrett had been checking something. The bedroom for the time, the kitchen for, a glass of water? Medication? And the living room window to look outside, perhaps watching the street before returning to bed. But if that was true, then he was still checking those same things every single night, 6 months after his death. Pause 1 second. I started paying closer attention to the timing of the sounds. I kept a notebook by my bed and recorded when they started, how long they lasted, and any variations in the pattern. What I discovered made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The footsteps weren't just random creaking. They were getting more frequent. During my first month in the apartment, I heard them maybe 3 or 4 times a week. By the second month, it was almost every night. Now in my third month, they happened without fail, every single night at 11:30. And lately, I'd started hearing them during the day as well. At first, it was just an occasional creak during afternoon study sessions, but gradually the daytime walking became more regular too. Always the same pattern, always the same route, but now happening multiple times throughout the day and night. I started to wonder if my presence in the apartment below was somehow making the phenomenon stronger. If Mr. Garrett's spirit, or whatever was left of his nightly routine, was becoming more active because there was finally someone there to witness it. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't afford to move. My lease wasn't up for another 9 months, and I couldn't afford to break it and pay for a new security deposit somewhere else. I was stuck with my invisible upstairs neighbor and his nightly walks. That's when I decided to try something different. If Mr. Garrett was stuck in some kind of routine, maybe I could communicate with him. Maybe I could help him understand that he didn't need to keep checking the bedroom, kitchen, and window every night. I know how crazy that sounds, but when you're desperate for sleep and you've exhausted all logical explanations, you start considering illogical ones. The next night, when the footsteps started their familiar journey, I got out of bed and followed along below, matching the pace exactly. When the sounds paused above the kitchen area, I paused in my kitchen. When they moved to the front window, I moved to mine. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then, instead of the footsteps returning to the bedroom, I heard something new. 3 distinct knocks on the floor above me. My heart nearly stopped. I stood frozen in my living room, staring up at the ceiling, hardly daring to breathe. After a long moment, I raised my hand and knocked 3 times on my own ceiling. The response was immediate. 3 more knocks from above, followed by what sounded like the slow dragging of furniture across the floor. That's when I realized Mr. Garrett wasn't just walking his nightly route. He was trying to tell me something. Those pauses at each location weren't just habit. He was waiting for something, looking for something. And now that I was finally paying attention, he was trying to show me what it was. The dragging sound continued for several minutes, moving back and forth across the floor above. It sounded like he was pushing something heavy, repositioning it. Then the footsteps resumed, but this time they went to a different part of the apartment. Somewhere I hadn't heard them go before, toward the back corner where my bedroom closet was located. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, 5 sharp raps directly above my closet. I opened the closet door and looked up at the ceiling. There was a small access panel I'd never noticed before, painted the same color as the surrounding drywall. It was slightly askew, as if someone had recently moved it. With a shaking hand, I pushed the panel aside and reached into the dark space above. My fingers touched something smooth and rectangular, a box hidden in the crawl space between floors. I pulled it down carefully. It was a shoebox, old and worn, with Mr. Garrett's name written on the lid in faded ink. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were dozens of letters tied with a blue ribbon. Love letters, written in elegant handwriting and dated from the 1960s. At the bottom of the box was a photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. On the back, someone had written, "My darling Margaret, I'll love you always. Thomas." There was also a small piece of paper, newer than the letters, with a local address written in the same shaky handwriting that was on the box. Below the address, in what looked like Mr. Garrett's final note to himself, were the words, "She should have these. I never had the courage." The footsteps above had stopped completely. The apartment upstairs was finally quiet. I spent the next day trying to track down the address from the note. It led me to a small house across town, where I found Margaret Winters, now in her 70s, tending to a garden full of roses. When I told her about Mr. Garrett and showed her the box of letters, her eyes filled with tears. "Tommy," she whispered, holding the photograph with trembling hands. "I wondered what happened to him. We lost touch so many years ago, but I never forgot him." She told me they had been engaged in 1967, but circumstances had forced them apart. Her family had moved away, and in those days before cell phones and social media, they had simply lost contact. She had always hoped he would find her someday, but as the years passed, she assumed he had moved on with his life. "He kept my letters all these years," she said, carefully unfolding one of the yellowed pages. "I can't believe he never forgot." I returned to my apartment that evening with a profound sense of peace. For the first time since I'd moved in, the building felt truly quiet. The apartment above remained silent through the night and every night since. Mrs. Chen was surprised when I told her what had happened, but not entirely skeptical. "Mr. Garrett was a romantic," she said. "Always talked about a woman he'd loved and lost. I think he would be happy knowing she finally got his letters. I lived in that apartment for the rest of my college career, and I never heard another unexplained sound from upstairs. But sometimes, late at night when I was studying, I would think about Mr. Garrett's 30-year vigil. How he had walked the same path every night, checking his bedroom clock, going to the kitchen where he kept her letters hidden, and standing at the living room window, perhaps hoping to see her walking down Elm Street. Love, I learned, doesn't always end with death. Sometimes it just needs a little help finding its way home. 2 years later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Margaret Winters was marrying a kind widower she'd met at a community center, but she wanted me to know that she kept Mr. Garrett's letters in a place of honor in her new home. She said she felt his blessing on her new happiness, and that sometimes, late at night, she could swear she smelled his cologne, a gentle reminder that true love never really dies. The apartment above mine was eventually rented to a young couple who never reported any unusual sounds. But I still live in the same neighborhood, and sometimes when I walk past the old Victorian house on Elm Street, I look up at that second-floor window. In the early morning light, just for a moment, I sometimes think I see a figure there waving goodbye. The night shift at Cedar Hill took the job at Cedar Hill Medical Center because I needed the money and didn't mind working nights. As a nursing assistant on the geriatric ward, my duties were straightforward. Check on patients, help with basic needs, and alert the nurses if anything seemed unusual. The pay was decent, the work wasn't too demanding, and the night shift differential helped cover my student loans. What I wasn't prepared for was how different a hospital feels after midnight. During the day, Cedar Hill bustled with activity. Doctors making rounds, families visiting, therapists working with patients, the constant hum of a busy medical facility. But at night, especially on the third floor where I worked, the building transformed into something else entirely. The long corridors stretched into shadows. The fluorescent lights hummed with an almost hypnotic drone, and every small sound seemed amplified in the artificial quiet. The geriatric ward housed patients with various conditions, from those recovering from surgeries to others dealing with dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Many of them slept poorly, calling out in confusion or wandering their rooms in the early hours. It was part of the job, and I learned to move through the darkness with practiced ease, offering comfort and guidance back to bed when needed. But there was one room that always made me hesitate before entering. Room 314. The patient was Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, an 87-year-old woman with advanced Alzheimer's who had been admitted 3 weeks before I started working there. During my orientation, the charge nurse Linda had given me specific instructions about Mrs. Blackwood's care. "She's generally quiet during the day," Linda explained as we walked past her room. "But she becomes very agitated at night. She insists that someone is in her room with her, someone she calls the man in the gray suit. She'll have long conversations with this person, sometimes getting quite upset." I glanced through the doorway and saw a frail woman sitting by the window, staring out at the parking lot with vacant eyes. "Hallucinations are common with her condition," Linda continued. "Just go along with whatever she says. Don't try to convince her that no one's there. It only makes things worse." During my first week, I learned that Linda was right about Mrs. Blackwood's nighttime behavior. Almost every night around 2 a.m., I would hear her voice from room 314, carrying on animated conversations with her invisible visitor. Sometimes she sounded happy, even laughing at what appeared to be jokes. Other times she seemed distressed, pleading with someone to stay or asking repeatedly why they had to go. The conversations always followed a similar pattern. Mrs. Blackwood would greet her visitor warmly, as if welcoming an old friend. They would talk for 20 or 30 minutes, with her side of the conversation ranging from reminiscences about the past to concerns about family members. Then, inevitably, she would become upset, begging the person not to leave and finally falling silent as if her visitor had departed. I felt sorry for her. Alzheimer's is a cruel disease that steals memories and creates confusion, but it can also populate a person's world with ghosts from their past. I assumed the man in the gray suit was probably her late husband or another family member. Her deteriorating mind had conjured as a source of comfort in the sterile environment of the hospital. What bothered me, though, was how detailed and consistent her hallucination was. Most patients with dementia experience fragmented, chaotic visions that change from day to day. But Mrs. Blackwood's visitor never varied. He always arrived at the same time, wearing the same gray suit, and their interactions followed predictable patterns that suggested a deep, established relationship. During my second week, I decided to pay closer attention to these nighttime conversations. Not to interfere, but to better understand what was happening so I could provide appropriate care. I began lingering in the hallway outside room 314 during the early morning hours, listening to Mrs. Blackwood's side of the dialogue. "Oh, there you are," she would say, her voice suddenly bright and alert in a way it never was during the day. "I was starting to worry you weren't coming tonight." Then she would pause, as if listening to a response before continuing with updates about her day or concerns about her situation. "The food here isn't very good," she might say, or, "I don't understand why my daughter hasn't visited. She said she would come on Thursday." What struck me most was how lucid she sounded during these conversations. During the day, Mrs. Blackwood rarely spoke in complete sentences, and often seemed confused about where she was or what year it was. But at night, talking to her invisible visitor, she was articulate and coherent, discussing complex topics with apparent understanding. One night, I heard her crying softly after one of these conversations had ended. When I went in to check on her, she was sitting on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He had to go again," she said, looking at me with unusual clarity. "He never stays as long as I wish he would." "Who had to go, Mrs. Blackwood?" I asked gently. "Henry," she replied without hesitation. "My brother Henry. He comes to visit me every night, but he always has to leave too soon." I made a mental note to check her family history in the morning. Understanding more about her relationships might help me provide better care during these emotional episodes. The next day, I looked through Mrs. Blackwood's file and found contact information for her daughter, Patricia. I called during my break, explaining that I was trying to better understand Mrs. Blackwood's nighttime agitation and wondering if she could tell me about family members her mother might be remembering. She talks about someone named Henry, I said. She seems to think he visits her at night. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Patricia spoke. Henry was my uncle, my mother's younger brother. They were very close growing up. He died in a car accident when he was 35. That was, it must be nearly 50 years ago now. She seems to have very vivid conversations with him, I explained. I just wanted to understand the relationship so I could respond appropriately. They adored each other, Patricia said, her voice soft with memory. Henry was the only one who could make my mother laugh when she was upset. Even after he died, she would talk about him all the time. She always said he looked so handsome in his gray suit at the funeral. She kept a picture of him wearing it on her nightstand for decades. After that conversation, I found myself paying even closer attention to Mrs. Blackwood's nighttime visitor. The details Patricia had shared made the hallucination seem more poignant, but also more unsettling. How could someone with advanced dementia maintain such a consistent and detailed fantasy about a brother who had died 50 years ago? It was during my third week that I began to notice something that made me question whether Mrs. Blackwood was actually hallucinating. I was doing my usual rounds at about 2:30 a.m. when I heard her talking in room 314. But this time, as I approached the doorway, I could swear I heard something else. Not another voice exactly, but a sound that suggested someone else was in the room. A soft rustling, like fabric moving, or perhaps the quiet creak of a chair under someone's weight. I paused outside the door, listening carefully. Mrs. Blackwood was in the middle of what sounded like a pleasant conversation about a garden she used to tend. Do you remember the roses by the back fence? She was saying. The red ones that bloomed so beautifully in June. I always meant to plant more of those. Then there was silence, as if she was listening to a response. During this pause, I heard it again. A soft sound, almost like someone shifting position in a chair. But when I peered around the doorframe, I could only see Mrs. Blackwood sitting by the window, apparently alone. The strange thing was, her head was turned slightly to the left, toward the chair beside her bed, and her eyes were focused on something at exactly the height where another person's face would be if they were sitting there. Pause 1 second. Over the next few nights, I became more systematic in my observations. I would position myself just outside the room during Mrs. Blackwood's conversations, paying attention not just to what she was saying, but to environmental cues that might suggest she wasn't actually alone. The temperature in room 314 was consistently cooler during these nighttime visits, several degrees lower than the hallway or adjacent rooms. The overhead light would flicker occasionally, even though it worked perfectly during the day. And there were the sounds I couldn't explain. Soft footsteps on the linoleum floor, the whisper of fabric against fabric, and once, what sounded distinctly like the springs of the visitor's chair creaking under invisible weight. Most unsettling of all was Mrs. Blackwood's behavior during these conversations. Her demeanor, her posture, even her speech patterns changed dramatically from her daytime confusion to nighttime clarity. It was as if the presence of her visitor restored some essential part of herself that the disease had taken away. One night, I decided to test my growing suspicions. When I heard Mrs. Blackwood begin her nightly conversation, I quietly entered the room and took a seat in a chair near the door, far enough away not to intrude, but close enough to observe carefully. "Oh," Mrs. Blackwood said, noticing me for the first time during one of these episodes. "Henry, I'd like you to meet Sarah. She's one of the nice young ladies who takes care of me here." She turned to the empty chair beside her bed and continued, "Sarah, this is my brother Henry. He comes to visit me every night." Then she looked back at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to acknowledge the introduction. Not wanting to distress her, I nodded politely toward the empty chair. "It's nice to meet you, Henry," I said softly. That's when something extraordinary happened. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My breath became visible in the suddenly cold air, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched by someone other than Mrs. Blackwood. The chair she had been addressing creaked softly, as if someone had just settled more comfortably into it. And for just a moment I could swear I saw a faint impression in the seat cushion, the kind of depression that forms when someone sits down. Mrs. Blackwood smiled warmly. "He says it's nice to meet you too, and thank you for taking such good care of me." I sat in that room for the next half hour, watching Mrs. Blackwood carry on her conversation with an invisible companion, while I experienced a series of phenomena I couldn't explain. The temperature fluctuations continued. The chair creaked periodically, and at one point I caught a whiff of aftershave, old-fashioned and masculine, nothing like the antiseptic hospital smells that usually filled the air. When the conversation ended, as it always did, with Mrs. Blackwood becoming emotional about her visitor's departure, I watched the empty chair carefully. As she said goodbye, the cushion seemed to return to its normal shape, as if someone had just stood up. The temperature in the room gradually returned to normal, and the feeling of being observed by an unseen presence faded away. Mrs. Blackwood turned to me with tears in her eyes. "He has to go back now," she said, "but he'll come again tomorrow night. He always does." Over the following weeks, I continued to witness these nightly visits. Sometimes I would sit quietly in the room. Other times I would observe from the hallway, but the phenomena remained consistent. Whatever was happening in room 314 went far beyond the hallucinations typically associated with dementia. I began to research the hospital's history and discovered that Cedar Hill had been built on the site of an old residential neighborhood. In the 1960s, dozens of homes had been demolished to make way for the medical center. I wondered if somehow the connection between Mrs. Blackwood and her deceased brother was strong enough to transcend not just death, but the physical transformation of the place where their relationship had been strongest. One night, about 6 weeks into my employment, Mrs. Blackwood seemed different during her conversation with Henry. Instead of the usual updates about her day or reminiscences about the past, she appeared to be discussing something serious and important. Her side of the conversation was more subdued, punctuated by long pauses and occasional nods of understanding. "I know," she said at one point. "I've been feeling it too." Later she said, "Will it hurt?" Followed by a long silence, and then, "Thank you for explaining. I'm not afraid anymore." Near the end of the conversation, she asked, "Will you be there with me?" And then smiled at whatever response she received. "Good. I don't want to go alone." The next morning, Mrs. Blackwood didn't wake up for breakfast. When I went to check on her, I found her lying peacefully in her bed, looking more serene than I had ever seen her. She had passed quietly sometime during the early morning hours, with no signs of distress or discomfort. The official cause of death was listed as complications from Alzheimer's disease, but I knew better. Mrs. Blackwood had been preparing for this transition during that final conversation with Henry. Her beloved brother had come to ease her fears and guide her through the process of letting go at the funeral. I met Patricia and told her about her mother's nightly visits from Henry, carefully omitting the more inexplicable details I had witnessed. She wasn't surprised. "Mother always said Henry would come for her when it was time," Patricia told me. Even when she started forgetting everything else, she never forgot that promise. She said he told her right before he died that he would make sure she wasn't alone when her time came. I still work the night shift at Cedar Hill, though I've since moved to a different ward. Room 314 has housed several other patients, but none of them have reported any unusual nighttime visitors. The temperature stays normal, the lights work perfectly, and the visitor's chair beside the bed remains empty. But sometimes, when I'm walking past that room during my late-night rounds, I catch a faint whiff of old-fashioned aftershave in the hallway, and I remember Mrs. Blackwood's faith that love transcends death, that the bonds between souls are stronger than the diseases that attack our minds, and that sometimes when we need them most, those we've lost find a way to come back and remind us that we are never truly alone in the darkness. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey into the dark. 3 stories that remind us the world holds mysteries we may never fully understand. The midnight delivery that led nowhere. The love that echoed from an empty apartment above. And the brother who crossed back from death to comfort his sister's final days. These shadows and whispers, these unexplained encounters, they're part of the fabric that makes our world so beautifully strange. If you have your own mysterious tale, your own brush with the unexplained, send it to Dark Night. Perhaps your story will be the next one shared in these quiet hours when sleep beckons. Make sure you're subscribed to Dark Night and turn on those notifications so you never miss our next venture into the unknown. Until we meet again in the darkness, sleep peacefully, and may your dreams be filled with wonder rather than fear. The night watches over you now.